Hi, everybody. So in this lecture, we are going to go over just some basic things to consider when we are looking at fiction. So for our English 1B class, our first unit is concerned with fiction specifically, and we're going to be looking at several different short stories. So we're going to look at all of the different things that you should consider as you are reading those short stories. So the first thing to be aware of is one of our major goals for this part of class is that we're going to be looking at and interpreting fiction. So fiction, if you're not familiar with the term, just refers to stories or narratives about imagined events. Sometimes they can be based on true stories, but the actual, plot, characters, etc. are usually made up by the author. So, as I mentioned in this unit, we're reading and writing about a bunch of different short stories. To successfully write about fiction, we need to practice close or critical reading. So, a reminder about critical reading. When we're reading critically, we are reading actively and attentively. We're doing things like annotating and looking up words that we don't know. And we're doing some background research before we start reading a text so that we understand the context, maybe some information about the author, all of those good things that will help us to better understand what the author has to say in their story. Some basic terms to make sure that you are aware of before we get started with this unit are all listed here. So all of these are in your assigned reading from our textbook, and you should make sure that you have a good working understanding of all of these terms. So we want to look at and understand things like conflict, plot, genre, a narrator, characters such as the protagonist and antagonist, setting, and then also things like style, prose, images, figures of speech and symbols, things like tone and theme. So we want to become familiar with all of these different terms so that we're ready to start using those terms to talk about what we've read. And before you even get started on your first short story, something that you should do is a little bit of pre-reading. So one of the things that I ask students to do is to sort of get ready to read. You should get to a comfortable place where you can kind of get settled in and take your time with your reading. You should also gather your materials so that you're ready to highlight and take notes on the text. If you are reading online, that might look like an annotation app. If you're reading something that you've printed out, maybe you have actual highlighters, whatever works for you. I suggest reading somewhere quiet like a library or a cafe. Maybe put on some headphones so you're not disturbed, but everyone's different, so do whatever works for you. It's also a great idea to let whoever your people are know that you are settling in to read for a while and you're going to be unavailable. So for me, that's like my husband and my kids. I have to say, hey, I'm reading. I need you guys to, try not to disturb me for maybe the next half hour, right? So at least give that a go. Once you're ready to read and you're in a place that's comfortable for you, you hopefully have limited some of your distractions, then you should start by just looking over the text. We want to look for clues about the author's purpose, gauge our expectations, and make predictions. So for example, I might look at the title of a piece. Maybe it's called The Yellow Wallpaper. That's one of the stories we'll be reading. So a prediction that I can make is that this might have something to do with some yellow wallpaper. Maybe somebody loves it. Maybe they hate it. Maybe the characters fight about it. I don't know, but those are some predictions that I might make just based on looking at the title. Another thing that you should do to prepare is to research the author and read about the context for the piece. So for our class, you'll usually have a core text that you're reading along with additional readings that I give you to provide context. And those are really important because they help us understand things like what was happening when the text was written, where it was written, things that might have mattered to the author that are significant. So make sure that you do check those out before you start reading, and you'll set yourself up for a much more successful reading experience. You should also gather any questions or assignments surrounding the piece so you're ready to look for answers, highlight important passages, and kind of know your purpose for reading the text. So some things to pay attention to as you are completing this pre-reading part of reading our different pieces. At this stage, you should pay attention to things like the author, the genre, the context, the purpose, and relevant background information. Another way to refer to that is the rhetorical situation. So we want to look at things like, what is the author's purpose? Who are they writing for? What genre does this, exist in, right? So for our purposes for right now, we're looking at short stories. So we know we're not getting into like a novel. We know we're not reading poetry right now. So we kind of know what to expect if we pay attention to things like genre and context. So once you've done your pre-reading, then the next step is to read for understanding. I would encourage you to read or listen to the text once, just for a basic understanding. We want to understand things like the plot, the characters, and the setting just on the surface level. You might also notice some clear themes or literary devices at this point, and that's great. But generally, I say just come to the text, give it a quick overview, highlight areas that you'd like to come back to. And this is also a good time to write questions and responses that you notice in the margins so that when you come back to read a little bit more closely, you remember where you wanted to go back to. As you're reading for understanding, so once we come back and we want to look at the text again more clearly, pay attention to things like narrator, the setting, the plot, the characters, and the conflict. So we want to not only understand just a very general, basic understanding of what's happening, but also start looking a little bit more deeply at things like who is talking? What do we need to pay attention to about that? Is this narrator somebody that we can trust, or do we think that their view might be skewed in some way? Where is the story taking place, and why is that significant? What do we notice about the characters? What do we think the author might be pointing out to us based on the characters, their actions, through the plot, what conflict we're noticing? So all good things to focus on. Another thing to do next is to reread the text for your assignment. So surrounded by whatever text we're reading, you'll see a bunch of different assignments that you're ultimately working towards, right? So you might have discussion board posts that you're trying to accomplish. You might have an essay that you're working toward. So it's a good idea to look at the text, but now think about, what am I trying to accomplish? What do I need to get from this text? And so you can start reading critically and with purpose. So read your assignment or assignments and identify your purpose. Then return to the text, reading more closely, annotating as you go, and gathering that evidence that you need to support your answer to your assignment. So for example, let's say that I had a prompt that said I needed to discuss how A Rose for Miss Emily uses symbolism to comment on real-world issues of the time. Maybe that prompt also asked me to use 2 examples from the story as evidence to support my discussion. So by reading this example prompt, I can tell that in that assignment, I would need to find and be ready to talk about instances of symbolism. My answer also requires me to identify and explain how that symbolism kind of connects to something going on in the real world. And then I know that I need to find and be ready to discuss 2 examples from the text to support my answer. So now I've got some clear goals for myself. I need to focus on symbolism. I need to have something to say about how that symbolism connects to or comments on real-world issues at the time. And in the process, I need to use 2 examples from the text. So now when I'm looking at this text again, I'm looking with the purpose of identifying those things so that I'm ready to answer that prompt. So when I'm reading critically and with purpose, some things that I'm focusing on are style, prose, images, figures of speech, and symbols that the author might be using, tone and theme. So all of those kind of underlying things that the action of the story will help me to better understand. So a quick recap. When we are preparing to read, we should get comfortable, get background info, and get ready to read actively. Then you should read for understanding. Read the text just to understand the basics. Who is involved, who are the characters, what's the plot, what is actually happening on the surface of the text. And then come back and read with purpose. Read actively and analyze what you think all of it means. And then remember to keep your assignment in mind and work toward fulfilling the assignment requirements. So gather your evidence, answer questions posed in the prompt, and prepare to write your answers.